Good, good. Yeah, I have a question for you guys this morning, and I want you to think about it without answering me for just a minute. Just think about it in your own heads. Well, this is a pretty important question, I think, especially for us in this room. What do you think that it means to be a Christian? Once again, please don't yell answers out. We don't want to cause a public riot or anything, but what do you think it means to be a Christian? Just think about that for a sec. And I'll share some numbers with you. As of 2014, this is pretty interesting to me, over 70% of the U.S. population identifies themselves as Christian. Over 70% of this nation identifies themselves as Christian. That's a pretty big number. That is the large majority, right? What does it mean to be a Christian? Because, hey, 70%, I think that'd be really neat if it was true, but I think it'd probably be more accurate to say that 70% of this country identifies with the term Christian. But if you ask the average person who identifies with Christianity, what does it mean to be a Christian? I think you're going to find a huge disparity of opinions, disparity of answers. Because some will say, well, I'm a Christian because I go to church, by which the majority, statistically speaking, mean I go to church on Christmas and or Easter. And some people will say, I'm a Christian because I believe in the existence of God. I don't have any kind of particular lifestyle that goes with that, but the belief itself is what makes me a Christian as opposed to a not Christian. And then other people would even say, I'm a Christian because I was born Christian. My parents were Christian, their parents were Christian, I was born into a Christian home, and therefore I am a Christian, taking it to be almost like a hereditary trait you can pass down. I've got Christianity in my blood. And we have a lot of ideas, a whole lot of ideas as to what makes a Christian, even with churchgoers. Even if you were to take a poll for the average 10,000 people who go to church regularly, you would find a lot of variety in the opinion on what does it mean to be a Christian, which is funny to me because you think that'd be like the one thing that we would really have nailed down after 2,000 years of trying to figure this out, you know? And actually, it ends up becoming something of a problem because the concept of Christianity in our country, at least, has become so muddled and so unclear that nobody, or most people, aren't really sure what makes a Christian to begin with. And so anybody then can identify themselves with Christianity. Anybody can say, yeah, I'm a Christian. And nobody can really say with any certainty whether, okay, yay or nay, they are actually a Christian because the standard's so unclear. And so that becomes a problem when anybody, no matter how messed up their lives are or how terrible their actions are, can say, well, yes, I'm a Christian as I do these things. Or they can speak the lingo, or they can learn the right things to say. And we can't really say, well, yeah, that guy's clearly a Christian, or that guy's clearly not a Christian. And I'll give you an example of why this can be problematic. I'm going to read off a quote to you guys. This was a quote that was in one of the speeches of an extremely famous world leader from somewhere in history. This could be 4,000, 2,000, 10 years ago. Somewhere in world history. I'll go ahead and read it to you. In this hour, I would ask of the Lord God only this, that he would give his blessing to our work, and that he may ever give us the courage to do the right. I am convinced that men who are created by God should live in accordance with the will of the Almighty. No man can fashion world history unless upon his purpose and his powers there rests the blessing of this providence. Once again, don't yell out answers, but just pick a guess in your head somewhere. What world leader said that inspiring quote? Ready? It was Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler said that in speaking and addressing his nation. Now, if the shock of the other people around you wasn't enough, that is definitely a little jarring to hear those words come out of that man's mouth, because 50 years later, we can look back upon his actions and say he was one of the most diabolical men in the history of the world, pretty safely. And we say, okay, here's this guy Adolf Hitler, who, by the way, he did claim to be a Christian. He claimed to be a Christian, and he knew how to say the right things in order to get a predominantly Christian nation to elect him as their leader. Germany was predominantly Christian at the time. So we say, okay, surely surely Hitler of all people wasn't a Christian, right? Surely. When you look at his life and you look at the things that he did, which we have a lot of records of at this point, the atrocities he committed, we actually know that he hated Christians. He hated the church. He did his best to wipe it off the face of German soil in his time in leadership. And we say, okay, surely that guy can't be a Christian. But then we say, okay, well, by what standard do you say that? What is the clear standard that you're comparing him to where you say, well, he is a Christian or he is not? But what's cool here, and this is what we're talking about this morning, what's cool is contrary to popular belief, there's actually a very solid and very clear definition of what a Christian is or isn't. Speaking of the term itself, once again, don't throw out your answers here, but does anybody know, we can do this by raise of hands, know where the term Christian originated? It's funny, you think, okay, well, Christian, there's Christ in there somewhere, so I guess maybe we just labeled ourselves Christian after a while. But it was actually, the Christians didn't come up with the name for themselves. It was originally a derogatory term aimed at the early Christians, about 15 years after Christ's death. The movement was spreading all over the place. You had all these people who believed that this man, Jesus Christ, was the Son of God, and that he was raised from the dead, he was still alive, and they lived their lives dedicated to Jesus Christ. They lived their lives dedicated to him and aimed to mold their lives after the way he lived, right? This is what we know as Christianity. But before it had a label, it was called, they called themselves the Way, before it was Christianity. And the people around them, they would see all these people dedicated to this guy, Jesus Christ, and they started calling them Christians in a slightly mocking way, actually, because Christian closely translated means little Christs, or belonging to Christ. So it was originally something to kind of egg the Christians on with them, to mock them a bit. And then, of course, as historical Christians like to do, they eventually liked the name and just kept it. And this is why Christianity is known as Christianity, and this is why Christians are known as Christians, little Christs, or belonging to Christ. But that gives us a really clear idea of what the word itself means, doesn't it? It was a label given by other people to a group that followed Jesus Christ with their lives. That is what the name Christian means. A label for those who follow Christ with their lives. And so we can clearly say, with a lot of confidence here, that a Christian is a follower of Christ. And if you're not a follower of Christ, then you are not a Christian. So good, we've got the problem solved. However, it still gets complicated today because we say, well, 2,000 years later, Christ isn't around anymore. And what does it mean to follow him today? We can't do it the way they did it back then. Back then, they're out in the water and they're fishing, and this guy comes up and says, hey, follow me. They're like, you want us to take the fishing poles with us? And they're like, no, leave him here, just follow me. And so they just literally followed him. They walked around with him, and they talked with him, and they went all over the place with him, and they learned, and they drank, and they ate, and they did everything with this guy. But today, we can't really do that so much. We can't follow a physical Jesus around. So what does it mean for us today to be a follower of Christ? And Christ gives us the answer to that, possibly anticipating the problem. In John chapter 15, and most importantly for us, what he says here, he's going to show us how we can examine our own lives and see how well and truly and effectively we are following Christ with our lives. And it's a very important examination for us to make on a regular basis, as we're going to see momentarily. But here's the statement that he gives us. It's a very definitive statement. This is in John chapter 15. He says, by this God is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. By this God is glorified, bear much fruit, and by doing that, you prove to be my disciples. By doing that, by bearing much fruit, you prove to be a follower of mine. Wow, okay, so we've got the proof in the pudding, proverbially speaking. So I think Pastor Rick earlier said, my Brian stopped working for a moment instead of my brain stopped working. I think I was the only one that caught that back there. The proof is in the pudding for the follower of Christ, okay? He's got the word proof in there. Bear much fruit, so proving to be my disciples. And we really don't like to say, well, there's no evidence or no determining factor between a Christian or a non-Christian. There's no true Scotsman, is the classical logical fallacy. But Jesus is giving it to us himself. He's got the proof right there. Bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. This is how God is glorified. This is how we can clearly evaluate whether we are following Christ. In other words, whether we are Christian people. The simple question, are we bearing fruit? Are we bearing fruit? And that is going to be the big question we're going to be focused on for the next few weeks, as we're going to enter into a new message series titled Fruit and Roots. Are we bearing fruit? Are we bearing fruit? That's a question that we don't need to be asking ourselves once in a lifetime, but once a month, once a week, every day. Are we bearing fruit? So proving ourselves to be people who are following Jesus Christ with our lives. And so today, as we introduce this idea, we're going to take a quick look at what it means for a Christian to be rooted. What it means for a Christian to be rooted. But very quickly, before we move on here, let's think for a second. Christ says, bear much fruit, so proving to be my disciples. But what kind of fruit is he talking about? Clearly, it's not literal fruit. But what is the fruit exactly that he wants us to be bearing? What are these fruits that are apparently supposed to be growing in our lives that identify us to each other, to ourselves, and to the world as people who are followers of Jesus Christ? And the Apostle Paul shows us quite a few years later in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, in the very famous passage on the fruits of the Spirit. He says, these are the fruits that should be growing in the life of the Christian right here: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. I'll say it again. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It's an extremely famous passage from the Bible, but it falls into the same trap as so many of those famous passages, and it gets repeated so many times that we stop actually thinking about it. We stop actually saying, hey, am I exhibiting those things in my life? And Christ says, hey, you know what? Bear much fruit. That is what glorifies God, and that is how you're going to prove yourself to be a follower of mine. In other words, our own lives should start looking like Christ's life over a period of time. Because all those words, those are attributes that Jesus Christ portrayed in his own life. The love, the joy, the peace, the patience, the kindness, self-control, all those things he lived out in his own life. Those are all words you could use to describe Jesus Christ. And so the ultimate evidence that you are his follower is when your life starts slowly looking like Jesus Christ's. And Christ says, you know what, you should start looking like me. That's what it meant to be a follower. That's what it meant to be a disciple of someone in that day. You are learning how to do things in the exact kind of way as the person you're learning from. That's what Christian meant 2,000 years ago, and that's what it means today, and that's what it'll mean 2,000 years from now. Following Christ, learning how to live like him, bearing these fruits, and so proving to be a follower of his. And that's something of a little bit of a scary statement, isn't it? Because once you have the clear line in the sand drawn, on the one hand, if you look at your life and you're exhibiting those fruits, thumbs up. If you're growing in them and moving forward, great, moving in the right direction. But on the other hand, what if we aren't? What if we look at our lives and we can't see those things growing and moving forward? What if we're stuck in the same problems we've been stuck in for 5, 10, 15 years? What if we have consistent problems keeping our patience? What if we have serious issues with self-control? I hear people laughing out there because we're like, yeah, I think all of us would fall into that category. What if we don't line up perfectly with these fruits of the Spirit? What then? I think the point here is, and the point that Christ was trying to give to his followers, is that you need to be examining your lives and taking a good hard look, because I've given you the proof right here. Here's the line in the sand. And if you're not going to meet that standard, you better try harder. You better fix something. Whatever the problem is, figure it out, because here's how to tell for sure if you're on the right track or not. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Are these the fruits that we are growing in our lives? And that's quickly going to give us an indicator of how well or how effectively we're actually following Christ with our daily lives. We have a chorus happening out here. I want to sing, my children. Well, like I said, having a line in the sand so clearly can be a scary thing, because some of us can look confidently at our lives and see that we do not exhibit these things very well. We can look confidently and say, it doesn't seem like I'm improving in these things very much. And it happens a lot. It happens all the time, especially with new Christians. And so many people get discouraged and scared off and give up because they'll make a decision to follow Christ. I'm going to be a follower of Christ. I'm going to be a Christian. And they start following Christ, and they try to start doing what's right. They try to start changing their lifestyle, start growing that love and the joy and the peace and the patience and self-control, start growing those fruits of the Spirit and living their lives like Christ would. But invariably, they seem to hit a wall. It's not all smooth sailing. We've just been in a big series called The Road to Recovery. The road to recovery is not smooth sailing. There's 100 different bumps in the road and a few different major walls in the road. And people hit them. And after a while, it seems like the only fruits a new Christian can naturally produce, the only things that are naturally coming out of him are cruddy fruits, bad fruits. He keeps doing the same stuff he's been doing for 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 years. The same stuff keeps coming out of him naturally without him even trying to have to be a jerk. It just happens. He keeps making selfish decisions. He doesn't even have to try. Keeps getting angry and losing his cool. Doesn't even have to try. Keeps going back to his addictions without really even wanting to. These seem to be the only things that can grow out of us naturally, which leads so many people to say we are messed up and awful at our core. God didn't create us awful, but we sure do a good job of making it seem that He didn't. So the question is, why do we do what we do? Paul asked this question. Paul, who was on the same road to recovery as all of us, in the book of Romans, he said, why is it that I seem to do the very stuff I don't want to do? I clearly want to be loving and patient and kind and have self-control, but why is it that I do the opposite of all of those things? Why is it that those things are what naturally pop out of me? Whenever I don't have time to think, bam, here comes the biting remark. Whenever I'm in a high-pressure situation, why does it seem I always default to selfishness? Why do we do the very things we don't want to do? And you know what? I think the answer is relatively simple. I think the answer is pretty simple. We do what we do because of, to a large degree, of what we are. We do what we do because of our makeup. And I think the best way to help you guys understand this is the analogy of the fruit tree, which works really well with what we're talking about today. You look at the apple tree, okay? What is produced by the apple tree? Apples, okay? If you look at the pear tree, pears. If you look at the peach tree, peaches. The fruit tree grows whatever fruit that tree is growing. And you don't get a variation, you don't get any kind of weirdness there. Apples come from apple trees and so on and so forth. The fruit is the natural result of the kind of tree it is, of the tree's makeup, of the tree's roots at a very basic level. That is what it is and that is what it produces. And so a peach tree can try as hard as it wants to produce an apple, and it's not going to happen, right? The tree would have to, a peach tree would have to be changed at a basic level in order to produce an apple. It would have to be changed like down to its very core, its very roots to ever hope to naturally produce anything other than peaches. And we have all kinds of, I don't know, if you're sitting out there and going, well, recently they completed a test in which they grew a watermelon on a rose bush. And I would say, okay, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about naturally, you're not going to ever grow a rose bush that produces a watermelon. You understand my point, of course, okay? Don't be that guy. What's cool here is Christ made the exact same point. He made the exact same analogy in Matthew chapter 7. He said, every good tree bears good fruit, Every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. Therefore, you will be known by your fruit. Ouch. In other words, here's what he's saying. The fruits that naturally come out of your life are going to tell you exactly where your roots are at. The things that come naturally from you tell you exactly where your roots are at, exactly the makeup of your tree. So we struggle. We struggle to produce the fruit of Christianity, and it's hard, and it feels like it's unnatural, because so many times we're still rooted in the exact same stuff we were rooted in before we ever started trying to follow Christ. We haven't changed the makeup of our lives to a point where we should reasonably expect anything other than the same old fruit. We're still peach trees trying to produce apples. And Christ is really, really intentional about this analogy. He's not dumb. He says an apple tree does not have to try to grow an apple. A good tree doesn't have to try to grow a good fruit. A bad tree doesn't have to try to grow a bad fruit. It naturally produces that fruit as a result of its makeup, as a result of how it is rooted, as a result of what it is. And so in other words, if we can get our roots in the right place, change our makeup as human beings, the fruits are going to grow naturally. That's what he's saying. A tree that is rooted correctly, a good tree is going to grow good fruits. And likewise, a bad tree will grow bad fruits naturally. Our primary focus then has to be on getting our roots in the right place, and the fruit of the Spirit is going to naturally flow out of our lives. That's the point. You can't expect to change the basic makeup of your life and force yourself to grow an apple when you're a peach tree. And of course, all this is easier said than done, right? We can stand up here and talk about the theory and, oh, here's a good thing to do without ever talking about how to practically get to it. How can we do it? How can we go about rerouting our lives, our existences as human beings, as Christians, as people who are trying to follow Christ? And of course, I say roots, but we're not trees and we don't have literal roots. When I talk about roots, I'm talking about the things that we prioritize. Our roots are in what we prioritize as people, what we prioritize on a monthly, a weekly, a daily, an hourly basis. Our roots are in what we prioritize, and so the easiest way to figure out where your roots are is just look at where you spend the most time. Where do you spend most of your time? That's a really good indicator of what your priorities are. To illustrate, if you've got free time, I've got 4 hours of free time. If you spend the vast majority of that on mindless entertainment, guess where your priorities are? Mindless entertainment. Guess what kind of fruits are going to come out of your life? Some cruddy ones. And we're seeing the fruits of a culture that's dominated by mindless entertainment, from the internet to television to whatever else. And these are the fruits we're getting. So on the flip side, if you want roots in Jesus Christ as a follower of His, then the priority in our lives has to be in following Him. We can't expect, okay, well, up here I've got my job, and up here I've got actually making money, and over here I've got keeping myself entertained and happy and enjoying myself, and over here I've got food, and there's following Christ. I go to church if everything lines up, and down there is where I fit in the religion piece of the pie. If it's down on your list of priorities, don't you dare expect to be producing the fruits of Christianity in any kind of natural way at all. And that's the point of Christ's analogy there. If we want roots in Christ, if we want to be producing the fruits of the Spirit that identify us as His followers, as Christians, we have to have our roots in Him as our priority. So to keep this from being abstract, to keep this as practical as possible as we begin to wrap up here, I'm going to give you guys 3 very simple, very basic things that we can all start doing today to root ourselves in Christ as a follower of His. And something you'll notice, pretty much every series when we have some kind of like challenge, or if you want to start fixing this major problem, start doing this thing, usually it's in like the same list of 10 things, because life is not that complicated. There's usually a short list of things that you should be doing, and if you're not doing them, your life's probably messed up. So we're going to touch on 3 of the most important very briefly. It's something you haven't heard before, but it's something you should be hearing over and over and over again until you get it through your head, how important these things are. And we'll be looking at these things more and more as we go through the next couple weeks. But here's number 1. If you want to start rooting yourself, getting your roots out of over here and changing yourself from a peach to an apple, here's how you can start rooting yourself in Jesus Christ and putting your priority on Him. Number 1 is very simply communication, or prayer is another way of putting this. I like to say communication because we say the word prayer and we get so caught up in 1,500 years of ritual. And it's such a stiff thing, a ritual we go about, and we're not actually communicating any kind of relational way. I say communication because what prayer is simply the same thing as sitting down with your best friend or your spouse and pouring your heart out to them. That's what prayer is. Furthermore, prayer is asking God to be involved in those problems. That's all it is. And there's perhaps nothing that can root us more in following Christ and making Him our priority than spending time praying and communicating with Him. I'll give you an illustration here. You guys are all familiar with King David from the Bible, one of probably like the top 5 most famous characters in the Bible. If you've read any of the Old Testament, you've probably read something that King David wrote. Most of the Psalms, he's all through the Chronicles and so on and so forth. King David spent a massive amount of time alone with God. Despite his responsibilities, despite the kingdom he had to run, he spent a huge amount of time alone with God. It was very clearly, for the large majority of his life, his priority to be connected in relationship and in communication and in prayer with his God. He communicated his heart. He prayed. He talked with God. You can just read the Psalms and see this guy pouring his heart out on a regular basis to his Father. David was a man who was firmly rooted as a follower of God. This guy was, if there was anyone who was rooted, it was him. Aside from, you have a couple hiccups in his life where he goofed. But the vast majority of his life is characterized by an incredible natural outflow of good fruit. You know why? Because he was rooted in this. That was his priority. And where your priorities is, outflow the fruit. You're going to reap what you sow. And David reaped blessings and good character. Before Christ even came along, David was living like Christ lived. So that's very simply and very quickly number 1. On a regular basis, if you're not taking time, whether it's in a car or some of the jobs I've worked, I would go into like in a kitchen, I'd go into the walk-in freezer, and I'd lock myself in, and I would spend 2 or 3 minutes, as long as I could get out before I was missed, and just talk with God. That was what I needed to reorient myself and to root myself there as opposed to rooting myself in all the selfishness and lies and deceit that characterized my workplace. And that's what we have to do, because the world is going to pull us right along at its pace otherwise. That's number 1, prayer and communication. Number 2, as we go through these quickly, community and fellowship. Community and fellowship. Very, very early in the morning, in April 1945, a pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer was executed in the Nazi camp of Flossenburg. He was executed actually by the special order of Heinrich Himmler, who was Hitler's personal executioner. Bonhoeffer had been arrested 2 years before for being involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. By the way, if you don't know about this guy's life, I highly encourage you to read up on him, because this was an incredible, incredible man. But he had been arrested 2 years before, and over the period of that 2 years, he was transferred to 4 different major prisons, to here and to here and to here, all over the place. He was in Tegel and Berlin, Buchenwald, and finally Flossenburg. And in the moving from place to place, Bonhoeffer lost 100% all contact with the outside world. And so for a large portion of that 2 years, he had no contact with anyone he knew, no contact with anyone who was close with him. He had no fellowship or community at all. Everything he knew was severed from him. And according to his own testimony and some of the writings we've recovered from his, he lost the most precious possession that he had, and that was fellowship. He valued it so incredibly highly, but he lost it in those 2 years. There's a book he wrote called Life Together, in which he focuses on Christian fellowship and its massive importance for the follower of Christ. And he wrote in that book detailing the riches of the depth of that thing that he lost in those 2 years. He said this: "The physical presence of other Christians is a source of incomparable joy and strength to the believer, a physical sign of the gracious presence of the triune God. How inexhaustible are the riches that open up for those who, by God's will, are privileged to live in the daily fellowship of life with other Christians." And further, he wrote, "Let him who has such a privilege thank God on his knees. It is grace, nothing but grace, that we are allowed to live in the fellowship with Christian brothers." The fellowship of Christian brothers is the church. That's what we're looking at right here. And it's, in my opinion, one of the most important reasons the church exists at all, for the fellowship of the followers of Christ. Because here's the thing, God made us relational beings at our core. We are relational to the very root of our existence. Not just made for relationship with Him, but made for relationship with each other. And this is true of regardless, whatever sphere you're in, whatever thing you're trying to get good at, hanging out with people who have the same values as you, who are trying to do the same thing as you, is going to strengthen you one way or another. And so for the person who's trying to become rooted in Christianity, rooted in following Christ and making Christ his priority, spending a lot of time with people who are going to lift you up and encourage you and teach you and help you is incredibly important, as Bonhoeffer well understood. So that's number 2, community. If you're not making a specific effort to find Christian community, and not just on a Sunday morning, but during the rest of the week where you go back to the real world, please make an effort. And lastly, number 3, very quickly, serving. Serving. And we do this because we're following in Christ's example himself. He said in John chapter 13, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, wash your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done unto you." And there's nothing that ties our priorities together than sacrificing of ourselves and following in the example of Jesus Christ in serving those around us, whether they're a Christian or whether they're an atheist or whether they're a Buddhist or whether they have no strong opinions one way or another. Serve them. Find a way to serve them, because there's always going to be some way. And you'd be surprised how quickly your priorities snap together. And so very simply, I know that was quick, but very simply, those 3 things right there are a nice launching point. If you want to start ripping the roots up out of where they are in the world and rooting them into Jesus Christ as his follower, to start seeing those fruits naturally outflow from your life, these 3 things are a really good starting point. Prayer and communication, community and fellowship, and service. So the challenge here as we end this morning, as the band comes up, the challenge here is for us to take Christ's words. Here is what glorifies God. Here is how you prove yourself to be my disciples, to be a follower of mine, by bearing much fruit, by growing love, by growing peace and joy, gentleness and kindness, faithfulness, self-control. By growing these things in our lives, we need to take a hard look at our lives and say, am I growing these things? Am I exhibiting these things? Am I becoming more and more like Jesus Christ? And whatever the answer is, whether it's I'm right on track or whether it's I'm not there yet, the point is we can get on track. The fruit that we grow is a natural result of where our roots are. So we need to be evaluating ourselves and asking ourselves, where are my roots? And what do I need to do today to start rooting them in Christ? We're going to have some of our leaders come up here at the front as the band plays here in just a moment, but I'm going to pray to close us out. Father, thank you so much that you have given us such a strong, strong hope that we don't have to be caught up in the pace of the world, that we don't have to continually produce only bad fruit, that we're not trapped to selfishness, we're not trapped to anger or bitterness, but you've given us a way of freedom. Father, I pray that you would help us as we walk this path. Help us to root ourselves so firmly in Jesus Christ that we can't be pulled. We love you, Father. Amen.